It was the 31st of December 2002, and I was 25 years old. I finished work early as it was New Year's Eve and went to meet my sister and her partner for a couple of drinks before heading off to meet my mates at a party. I met her at a pub called the Camden Tup in Camden, London. As it was New Year's Eve, the place was absolutely packed solid. Strangely, however, there was a sofa with just one man sat on it and 3 or 4 other seats unoccupied. Result, I thought and scampered across and asked if we could sit. As I got closer, I realized the chap was quite old, disheveled with a ragged beard and didn't smell that great. The 2 things that jumped out at me the most though were the fact that he was absolutely huge, 6'4" or 5 at least, and he was strangely wearing a Spider-Man t-shirt, which just looked a little odd on him. Anyway, he grunted an okay and the 3 of us sat. We talked amongst ourselves, not paying him much mind, but I noticed that he was paying a lot of attention to my sister. She's a good-looking lady, so not that surprising, but he was just staring intently in a creepy way. Suddenly, he butted in and asked for her name. My sis, being the kindly hippie type, let him in the conversation and told him about herself. I asked what he did, and he said he was a video game designer. The t-shirt then made a little more sense. Spider Dude kept asking for my sister's address and phone number, until her then partner asked him nicely to stop. He looked furious, and didn't say much else, apart from to ask my sis to borrow her lighter. It got more and more uncomfortable though, as he continued to stare in a menacing way, so I suggested we leave. When outside, my sis remembered she hadn't gotten her lighter back off of him. I offered to go back and get it. I picked my way through the crowd and back to the sofa where he was sitting. I asked for the lighter and he held it out. As I was about to take it, he pulled it back and asked if I would buy him a drink. I politely declined and he threw the lighter at me. I then went off to meet my friends, and my sister and her boyfriend went off to enjoy their night. On the 2nd of January, I was on my way back to work and stopped off at the shop as usual to buy a paper to read on the train. This was back in the day when people still bought newspapers. When I got to the paper rack, I was absolutely floored. On lots of the front pages were pictures of Spider Dude. On one in particular, the Mirror, I think, there was a full-length picture of him wearing the Spider-Man t-shirt. The headlines were Wanted or On the Run. Turns out our drinking partner was Anthony Hardy. Hardy had over the course of the previous day or 2 murdered and dismembered 2 women and dumped their body parts in commercial bins in the area around the pub. He had then gone on the run. He was eventually caught when he went to try and pick up his medication at a local hospital. I called the police, who came to visit my office. I also called my sister, who was in shock. She left her flat, which was around the corner from the pub we met him in, for a few days and stayed with her friends on the other side of London. Hardy was eventually convicted of 3 murders, but was suspected of committing up to 9. He was given a whole life of tariff. I was friends with Nadal Hassan, the Fort Hood shooter. We were both trying to get into medical school at Virginia Tech. He was in biochem and I was biology. He dropped by the foosball table at school on and off for our 1st and 2nd years. I remember one of his parents dying and he took some time off. We both ended up getting into trouble in medical school in the internal medicine rotation and had to retake it. We took that rotation a 2nd time together and hung out a little, but we both failed it again. So I was pretty pissed off since I failed despite passing the exams, and we discussed it. He said that he was going to sneak away from the DC area to do his 3rd rotation so that he wouldn't be, quote, targeted to fail again. But I was like, screw that, I'm taking it at Walter Reed, and screw them if they fail me. He said that I was challenging the senior physicians, and I was, and that bruising their egos wasn't going to work out. He was right. He passed and graduated. I failed and left medical school after 5 years. During that same conversation, he did ask if my faith got them through these tough times, and I told him that I, quote, wasn't religious. Nadal seemed like he could barely believe that. I already knew that he was a pretty devout Muslim. As for his personality, when I knew him, he was soft-spoken and a genuinely caring person. He was really close with his family and spent most of his time with them. At times, he could be philosophical, but he was mostly friendly and easy to be around. Fast forward to after I left the military, and I'm in my car listening to the news about the Fort Hood shooter. His cousin comes on and starts going on about him. 4 years enlisted, went to VT, then went to the military medical school. I'm like, I know this guy. Sure enough, it was Nadal. That photo they have of him when he was young, that was the photo for medical school. I was with him when that photo was taken. Oh well, I guess a lot can change over 5 to 6 years. I won't try to defend what he did, that was truly awful, but I can say that he wasn't all bad. A little bit of background. She killed her second husband, my uncle, a med student and medic in Vietnam, after a nasty separation. He had borrowed a truck from a friend to take her belongings to her new house. Story has it they argued, resulting in her shooting him multiple times. She claimed that he showed up drunk and beat her, but the coroner's toxicity report found no trace of drugs or alcohol. Also, after he had been shot, she beat his face with a pistol so badly it broke the pistol butt. Her uncle, a prominent local attorney, was the first on scene and helped craft the self-defense narrative with the police. She was never charged with that crime. 20 years later, she killed her third husband, a local politician, when she discovered that he had been having an affair with another woman and was planning to leave her. She hid in the basement of their shared home, ironically the same house inherited from my uncle, and shot him when he came home. She claimed self-defense, that she thought it was a burglar. The police didn't buy it, and she was charged with a crime, although once again her high-powered attorney made mincemeat of the prosecution. To my knowledge, no one ever found out what happened to her first husband. This is what she was like. She was a large woman with a very intense presence. When she was around the family, she made an effort to be saccharine sweet, but her intensity put everyone on edge. She was constantly telling small lies and obsessing over defending or justifying them. She absolutely had to control the narrative and her image. One of the most shamelessly manipulative people I've ever met for sure. I distinctly remember her vibe. As soon as she walked into the room, you knew there was something not right with this person. In private, she would wait at home for my uncle to return from school or work and ambush him with any kind of grievance she had. They lived close by, so it was easy to hear them arguing too. One day, a nurse from the hospital called and tried to leave a message. When my uncle returned, she accused him of having an affair and flew into a rage, which ended with her locking herself in a bathroom with a pistol, threatening to kill herself. The local sheriff was called. She actually fired a gun a few times in the bathroom, but did nothing until my uncle broke down the door and talked her down. But after that, things changed. My uncle had legally adopted her daughter from her first marriage and was hesitant to leave them, but it became apparent that that was the only course of action. And then she killed him. But yeah, the warning signs were everywhere. This woman is known as the Albuquerque Black Widow. Years ago, I was living alone in Vancouver, BC. I used to party a lot, and even though I often woke up hungover, I still got up weirdly early. I'm pretty sure that this was in 2006 or so, and that I had a boyfriend at the time, but he was working. One of my favorite things to do when I was on my own on a day off was to take the bus, and then take the SkyTrain to the Metrotown Mall. It was a sprawling, gigantic mall with its own SkyTrain stop in neighboring Burnaby. I would eat mall curry from the Indian food kiosk and read the newspaper by myself. This, of course, was when I was much younger and cuter than I am now. Anyway, on this particular trip, I was smoking outside, sitting on the side of a fountain, and a young guy around my age, 24 I think at the time. He looked youngish, but at the same time seemed pretty rough trade, like could have been anywhere from 34 to 34, approached me to bum a smoke. I'm from Ontario, and I immediately recognized his accent as being a kind of working-class Southern Ontarian type, like shades of how the kids on the original Degrassi series spoke, totally different from how people in Metro Vancouver speak. At the same time, there were two interesting features of his speech. He spoke in this sort of deadpan, impassive, emotionless, drony kind of way, and he had some sort of Valley Girl-esque affections, pronunciations, and turns of phrase that read gay. He was wearing something that was sort of odd and unfashionable at the time for someone who was putting on airs of being quote-unquote cool. It was a muscle shirt and long Bermuda shorts with sneakers. He had gelled, bleach blonde hair, which was also pretty odd, like late 90s aesthetic for the time. He was pretty handsome and in shape but slightly beefy and not very tall. Totally not my type, both by his personality and the fact that he really did seem gay. Regardless, he was hitting on me and trying to ingratiate himself to me, complimenting me on being cool or cute and trying really hard to be my friend. I'm very polite and have historically had a hard time rejecting male attention, both out of fear that they'll get aggressive and weird, and because I don't like to hurt anyone's feelings, so I returned his attempts at conversation in kind but remained distant. Besides, he didn't seem gay, so maybe he was not the threat I was worried he was. I did get the feeling, though, that there was something very off about him, performative and sort of narcissistic. He spoke a lot about himself and didn't ask me questions about myself, and he talked about being a stripper for men in Montreal, maybe even insinuating that he was a hustler. He talked about the rave scene, which seemed kind of dated in 2006 and was totally not my bag. I actually remember him describing dressing up as an angel for a rave in great detail and talking about how hot he looked. Again, his manner and behavior all seemed very odd, socially off, and unlike anyone I knew or voluntarily would associate myself with. He followed me around the mall for something like an hour, came along with me while I bought shoes, and sat with me as I ate Indian food. We smoked together a few times. Eventually I feigned an excuse to leave and headed back to Vancouver. He basically made me give him my number, and I panicked and didn't give him a fake one. He texted me a few times after that, and I just didn't respond, and they eventually stopped. I can't remember what he told me his name was, but I feel like it was European sounding. Cut to years and years later, and Luca Magnotta made the news for killing that poor Chinese guy and doing horrible things to his remains, recording the act. As soon as I saw his face, I knew it was him. I was too creeped out to listen to a recording of his voice, but eventually one of my friends basically made me, and that really sealed it. I described his voice to her, never having heard a recording before, and she corroborated that it sounded like it could be him. I mean, it was just too specific of a tonal range or accent. I was 10,000% sure it was him. I also read later that he lived in the greater Vancouver area for a period of time around then, and gave out a few different fake names. In 1989, when a few of my mates were 19, we went camping in a state national park in Australia. One of our first days up there, despite the entire campgrounds being vacant, this bloke comes in and sets up camp right next to us with a tiny patch of bush in between. Being the middle of winter, this place was practically deserted. As the morning began, he started asking the three of us if we wanted him to take us up to the abandoned gold mine that afternoon. Two of the three of us had made the trek numerous times but didn't bother saying anything and were non-committal. As morning drew into afternoon, he finally wore us down, so two of us went. On the way up there, he was acting a bit nutty and diving into ice-cold rock pools, and he had a large Bowie knife strapped to his leg. Anyway, it was about a 6-kilometer hike up to the mine, and he was telling us how he'd been up there ample times, with us smirking at each other as we had been up there heaps. About 5 kilometers in, he says let's start heading up the mountain, at which point we were looking at each other confused, as the gold mine was at the bottom and up here was nothing but thick rainforest. So at one point I've turned to look over my shoulder at my mate only to find he was gone, and I was about 15 feet behind this bloke in the middle of nowhere, about an hour before dark. My guts just dropped, and I instinctively turned and fled. Now I had been a long distance runner, but I don't think I've ever run so fast in my life. When I made it back to camp, my other mate who had fled before me was holding a rifle and freaking out, asking questions like, what is he gonna do? I said give me the rifle and start packing up. Just as they started, this guy came tearing through the bushes and was manic laughing. Then he sees me with the rifle and mumbled something as he walked through the bushes. This really freaked us out and we packed within a half hour. He must have really legged it back to be that close behind us. We were all scared and happy to be driving out from this remote spot safely. It wasn't until years later we had watched something on the TV and were on the phone to each other that we come to realize the man was Ivan Milat, who went on to murder a heap of tourists in the forest and became one of Australia's most infamous serial killers. We were very lucky. Ivan Milat is known to have murdered 7 people, but the real number could be much larger. He typically murdered people in the Belonglo State Forest in New South Wales, Australia. Milat was convicted of the murders in 1996 and was given 7 life sentences. He died in prison in 2019. By accident, I kept my mouth shut for once. I tended a bar at a nightclub in New York City that had a party one night, a week which was extremely popular. Celebrities would show up quite a bit, actually. It was primarily a gay crowd, but got so popular that it turned into a mixed bunch. One night, I was behind my bar in the back, and a man came in. He had on a baseball cap, glasses, but he was very charismatic. He knew how to enter a room. He also looked familiar. He came up to me, smiled, and ordered a beer. I gave him his beer, he tipped me very well, and we chatted for a minute. I wanted to ask if I knew him because I kept feeling like I did. I almost said something but stopped myself. I knew he could very well be a celebrity who might not want to be bothered with that kind of question. He went on his way, and I got busy. The club was jammed with people. Later on in the night, I saw him speaking with a famous designer, so I figured he was one in the fashion business. More time passed. Then one night, I was talking to someone with whom I worked about Gianni Versace, how tragic his murder had been. He was shot by a man named Andrew Cunanan, who'd gone on a cross-country killing spree, which ended in Florida. And then my friend said, "You know he was in here, right? The FBI found his card and his belongings. He was talking to them in here on." And it was suddenly like tumblers turning in a lock. I asked my friend a few more questions. Everything just fell into place. The charismatic customer had been Andrew Cunanan. That's the reason he looked so familiar to me, right? When we set up the bar before we opened, we usually had the TVs on, and we were watching the news. He was on the FBI's most wanted list. I'd seen his photo repeatedly on the broadcasts. I thought of this so many times in the last couple of decades, because I was so close to saying to him, "You look so familiar." And what if I had? Would he have left? Would I suddenly realize who he was? Would he possibly have killed me? I know it's far-fetched, but still. Would Gianni Versace still be alive? Life is so arbitrary. Saying something, not saying something, all of it can have a really dramatic consequence, and it's impossible to know what those consequences might be. It's so very strange and at times chilling. My aunt worked closely with Michael Swango, aka Dr. Death, at the OSU Medical Center. She was the unit secretary of the neurosurgery ward where he worked as a surgeon. She said he was really charming almost to a superficial point. She also said his bedside manner was awful and he was obsessed with death. She didn't initially think much of it since that's surprisingly common amongst doctors. The thing that got her suspicion was how whenever he brought in food for his coworkers, everyone in the ward seemed to get sick. He was extremely handsome and women loved him, so he got around with many of the nurses and even asked out my aunt. She politely declined since she was dating the man who would later become my uncle. But one night when one of his dates was snooping around his kitchen, she found recipes for different poisons taped on the inside of the cabinet doors. She came back and told my aunt and a few others what she saw, and they reported it. Right around this time, a large amount of patients started dying. Keep in mind, neurosurgery in the early 90s was far from what it is today and had a much higher mortality rate. But before they could catch him, he killed a bunch of patients and fled the state. He eventually ended up in Zimbabwe and killed tons of people there too. US officials somehow tricked him into coming back to the US, and he was arrested and given life without parole. I lived very close to the railroad tracks in central El Paso, Texas, south of the freeway. One night, arriving home after having taken my mother shopping, I drove in near the front of the house and parked the car. But before I could unbuckle my seatbelt or turn off the lights, a strong force began to literally fill up every cell of my body and push me back into the seat. I could not move. I have never felt every single cell in my body like that before. Along with the force came a feeling that I can use only the very inadequate words terror and horror to describe. Those words don't even begin to describe what was filling me up. I was also filled with the absolute certainty, in every fiber of my being, that I had to keep my mother and myself in that car, or something unutterably and incomprehensibly evil would happen to us. It was all I could do to get the words, "Don't open the door," out of my mouth so my mother would not set foot outside the car. As she looked to me uncomprehendingly, I could tell she was wanting me to tell her what was going on, but I could not speak or move. She kept staring at me, and I kept being pushed against the seat. Finally she said, "For heaven's sake, Mary, I'm getting out." I was able to get the word "no" out of my mouth. It felt like in slow motion, and I must have scared her, but she settled down and just stared at me again. We sat there, headlights on in the front yard, her staring at me and me not being able to move or understand what was happening, for what seemed like another minute or two. That was until we finally saw a man, short, slight, and wearing one of those short-sleeved plaid shirts, move out of the darkness and into the light from the headlights. I'd had no idea anyone was there in the darkness. The arc of the light from the headlights illuminated him from what was about his throat to the top of his legs, his face in dark shadow. As he walked through the yard towards the street, the force began to let me go, and as soon as he left the yard, it slowly drained away from me, as if it was some sort of dense fluid. Once it was all gone, and I was sure it was okay, we got out of the car and ran into the house. Years later, I saw on TV that the railroad killer had been captured in our suburb near El Paso. He'd killed numerous people near or around the railroad tracks, and they showed a video of him. He was a short, slight man wearing a short-sleeved plaid shirt. Yes, I've met a serial killer in real life, and it was scary as hell. I was a young man living in the north of England, in Yorkshire. I just started dating a girl from Leeds a good few miles away from me, and I was pretty engrossed with the girl. She was my first. Her family were dead against me spending the night though, so subsequently I missed the last bus home and had to walk one night. So off I set. It was around 11 p.m. and I lived about 7 miles away, so I had at least an hour's walk home. I started thumbing for a lift. There wasn't much traffic, but I lived in hope. I'd been walking for about 20 minutes when I heard a car in the distance behind me. I stuck out my thumb and prayed. The car stopped. The front passenger door popped open. I should explain, I had fairly long hair back then and wore it in a ponytail. So I climbed into this car and the driver just stares at me for a good 10 seconds. His first sentence was, "I thought you were a girl," which wasn't quite as weird as it sounds, but he did seem to be a bit peeved. A spotty teenage lad got into his car instead of a girl. He asked where I was off to, so I told him it was the next village. It was on his way and wasn't a problem, a quick 10-minute car journey. Anyway, he started chatting about mundane stuff, football mainly. Then he asked if I had a girlfriend and if I had fucked her that night. With that, he tried to grab my hand, laughing and asking to sniff my fingers. I was getting really freaked out by this. I was quite a naive young lad back then. He then proceeded to tell me about his last girlfriend and how he'd her because she wouldn't give him sex. I tell you, all I wanted to do was get the fuck out of that car. My village was fast approaching, and at the road end I asked him to stop and drop me off, which thankfully is what he did. As I got out, he said, "You're a lucky lad. There's a lot of nasty bastards out there who would have robbed ya and took you for a ride." I mumbled my thanks and legged it home like the devil was chasing me. I was so bloody scared. 3 weeks later on the national news, I saw the bloke who gave me a lift. He was charged with the rape and murder of several young women around my area. His name was Peter Sutcliffe. He's still in prison and was the reason I stopped hitchhiking. The truth about evil and the people who commit serial murder is both scary and eye-opening. I spent some time incarcerated at the same prison as Orville Lynn Majors. He is suspected of having murdered in excess of 130 people while he was employed at a rural Indiana hospital. To put things in perspective, 1 out of every 3 people admitted to the hospital during his employment ended up dying. He was directly implicated in a minimum of 130 deaths, though convicted of only a handful, which was all that was needed to give him a 360-year sentence. My conversations with him started out as a function of my job as warehouse and inventory clerk at a license plate shop. I knew who he was from his news accounts and wanted to find out what kind of person could do such things. Prison politics are strictly enforced by the offenders, and you do not ever ask another inmate questions about why they are locked up, or if they actually did the crime, etc. To do so is to risk your life, literally. I had made it a policy to carefully observe people I considered to be dangerous and find out what motivates them. I wanted to learn what their mode of operations are like and what can potentially trigger violence in them. Orville is an extremely polite, congenial gay man who is easy to get along with and instills a level of trust in his co-workers. He worked closely with the guards, Pin Products, a prison-based industry, staff members, and other inmates as well. His conversations were jovial, and he would give you the shirt off his back and be willing to help with anything and everything. A very likable guy. Just like anyone else there, he had his moments of anger, disagreements with others, and the like. He did not appear to be any different from anyone else, on the surface that is. My observations of his behavior, however, chilled me to the bone. When people work closely together, they end up lowering their defenses around their coworkers. Orville is a very smart individual, and he knows this about human nature. You would never guess from casual observation and interaction that this man is a serial killer. I was struck by how casual the staff members acted around him, and how carefully he manipulated people into giving him ever-increasing levels of latitude and freedom. When watching him, I had to be careful and to do it from a distance. You do not want him to suspect you as potential danger. I'm actually a little apprehensive about it still as I write this answer. Whenever a staff member would lose focus on him, his entire demeanor would change, and he would make every attempt to do what he was actually wanting to do without discovery. Yet, he was back to good old Orville the minute someone refocused on him. Instantly. As if there were two completely different people in charge of his body. What he was really doing was plotting on the guards, staff, and other inmates. He was procuring items to make weapons, making certain things disappear on paper so that the prison would lose track of inventory. I've just crossed the line on convict behavior by sharing this, and he will likely be punished for what I'm saying. This is not my intent. I have no personal animosity toward him. I guess I relate this to you, because he is one of the most dangerous men I have ever met. Yet if I hadn't been exposed to other dangerous people before him, I would have never guessed, and would not have been as diligent in my efforts to keep an eye on him. I cannot believe how the guards and staff lowered their guard around him. It was an insanity to allow him near deadly tools and things that could be used to cause serious bodily harm. And yet, he was in close proximity to those things, unsupervised much of the time I observed his behavior. There was a quality about his demeanor that I had rarely, if ever, seen before. We were not real to him. We were just objects to be used and discarded as he saw fit. If he could use you, he was your dearest friend until he was done, or you were exhausted, at which time you were just another object in his way. In short, he was evil. I don't scare easily, but with this guy, I was constantly on alert. There was nothing to trust in him. You'd never guess how much he hates people from talking to him.